Picture this. You are standing on the bustling docks of Amsterdam in the year 1628. Before you is a magnificent new ship, the Batavia, the pride of the Dutch East India Company. It's a vessel of dreams, laden with silver coins, priceless jewels, and hopeful souls. Merchants, soldiers, families, all seeking their fortune in the exotic Far East. But whispers follow this grand ship. Whispers of a brewing conflict between its commander and its skipper, and of a strange, charismatic apothecary in the passenger list with unsettling ideas about God and man. Everyone believes this is a voyage to paradise, but they are sailing into a nightmare. What happened to the Batavia represents one of the most terrifying case studies of societal collapse and human depravity ever recorded. Before diving into this harrowing story of survival and savagery, if you enjoy exploring the dark corners of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please, comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these forgotten stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with the human condition. What you're about to hear isn't just another tale of a shipwreck. It's the story of how, when the rules of civilization are washed away by the sea, the darkness within humanity can be unleashed with terrifying speed, turning a small community of survivors into a kingdom of terror ruled by a psychopath. The name Jeronimus Cornelisz might not be familiar to you, but his actions on a desolate island will haunt you long after you finish listening. The Batavia was more than just a ship. She was a symbol of the Dutch Golden Age, a floating piece of the nation's wealth and ambition. On board were over 300 souls, a microcosm of Dutch society. At the top was Commander Francisco Pelsaert, a stern but experienced company man responsible for the valuable cargo. Beneath him was the skipper, Arian Jacobs, a skilled sailor who held a deep-seated grudge against Pelsaert from a previous encounter. And then there was Jeronimus Cornelisz, an apothecary from Haarlem, fleeing bankruptcy and accusations of heresy. To most, he was a well-read, charming gentleman. But beneath the veneer of civility, Cornelisz was a follower of a nihilistic painter, believing that man was a creature of impulse and that God and Satan were irrelevant illusions. For him, the voyage wasn't about new beginnings. It was about escaping his past and, perhaps, finding a stage for his monstrous philosophy. As the Batavia sliced through the Atlantic, these three men formed a toxic triangle of authority, resentment, and hidden ideology. The passengers and crew, meanwhile, settled into the long, monotonous routine of a months-long voyage, unaware that the real danger was not in the stormy seas around them, but in the human hearts sailing within. The ship was a powder keg of class tension and personal animosity, and Cornelisz was patiently waiting for the spark that would ignite it all. On the 4th of June, 1629, in the dead of night, the catastrophic moment arrived. Skipper Jacobs, having miscalculated their position, drove the Batavia at full speed onto a sharp coral reef in the Houtman Abrolhos, a treacherous archipelago off the coast of Western Australia. The sound was a deafening groan of splintering timber and tearing sails, jolting everyone from their sleep. Chaos erupted. Waves crashed over the decks, sweeping people and possessions into the churning black water. The ship, mortally wounded, began to list violently, its hull ripped open by the coral. In the panicked darkness, a frantic effort began to save who they could. Pelsaert and his officers managed to transfer around 180 survivors, along with some meager provisions and water, to a small, nearby island, a barren, windswept strip of coral and sand with no natural source of fresh water. The great ship, the symbol of their hopes, was now a broken wreck on the horizon, its treasures tantalizingly close, but its structure groaning, threatening to be swallowed by the sea at any moment. As the sun rose on the first day, the survivors stood on their desolate new home, cold, terrified, and utterly isolated, thousands of miles from any known civilization. The old world, with its laws and hierarchies, had sunk beneath the waves. The situation was dire. The small island, which would become known as Batavia's graveyard, had no food and, most critically, no water. The salvaged casks would not last long among nearly 200 survivors. Commander Pelsaert knew that their only hope for survival was to seek help. He made a courageous but heartbreaking decision. He, Skipper Jacobs, and about 40 other crew and passengers would take the ship's 9-meter longboat and attempt the impossible: to sail over 3,000 kilometers north to the Dutch trading post of Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, in Indonesia. It was a journey of incredible peril across an uncharted ocean in an open boat. As they prepared the small vessel, loading it with the most vital navigation tools and the last of the reliable water casks, a profound sense of abandonment fell over those left behind. They watched as their leaders, their best hope of rescue, rowed away until the longboat was just a speck on the vast, indifferent ocean. With Pelsaert gone, a power vacuum was created. The man who stepped forward to fill it was not a soldier or a sailor, but the quietly observant apothecary, Jeronimus Cornelisz, who had conveniently managed to stay behind on the island. With Pelsaert gone, Jeronimus Cornelisz began his transformation. He was the highest-ranking company official left, and he used this authority to take control of all salvaged goods, especially the food, water, and any weapons recovered from the wreck. He gathered a small council, not of the most righteous men, but of the most ruthless thugs and malcontents he had identified during the voyage. He then began to preach, drawing on his heretical beliefs. He told the desperate survivors that they were free from the chains of morality and law. God was a fiction, prayer was useless, and pleasure was the only true purpose. On this island, he declared, they would create a new paradise, a community free from the old world's constraints. At first, his words may have sounded comforting to some, a release from their hopeless situation. But it was a trap. He was not creating a utopia. He was building a cult with himself as its god-king. He moved all the weapons to a tent under his personal control and began to separate the survivors into groups, quietly identifying those who were loyal, those who were useful, and those who were a threat to his new, absolute power. The island was no longer a temporary shelter. It had become his personal kingdom. Once his power was consolidated, Cornelisz's true nature was revealed. His philosophy was not about freedom, but about license, the license to indulge his every cruel whim. A systematic purge began. Anyone who questioned his authority, was too ill to be useful, or simply belonged to a group he disliked was marked for death. The killings were not frenzied. They were cold, calculated, and often theatrical. Men were sent on fabricated errands to other islands and ambushed. Others had their throats cut in their sleep. Entire families, including women and children, were drowned in the shallows or bludgeoned to death. The mutineers, now bound to Cornelisz by their shared crimes, carried out his orders with brutal efficiency. For the remaining survivors, life became a living hell of constant fear. They were watched at all times, forced to feign loyalty to a regime that could murder them for a perceived slight. Cornelisz reserved the surviving women for himself and his lieutenants, treating them as property in his depraved new society. Over the course of 2 months, he and his followers murdered at least 125 men, women, and children, turning the island paradise into an abattoir. Not everyone fell under Cornelisz's sway. Before the massacres began, he had made a strategic decision that would prove to be his undoing. He sent a group of about 20 soldiers, led by a common soldier named Wiebbe Hayes, to a neighboring island, now known as West Wallaby Island, under the pretext of searching for water. Cornelisz expected them to perish from thirst, conveniently removing the strongest armed men from his path. But against all odds, Hayes and his men found a source of fresh water and food. They were thriving. When they tried to signal their success back to the main island, a few terrified survivors managed to escape and swim across the channel, bringing horrifying news of the massacres. Realizing they were next on Cornelisz's list, Hayes, a man of simple duty and profound courage, organized his men. They were soldiers, and they would act like it. Using rocks and salvage materials, they built a small, crude fort, a bastion of defiance against the madness that had consumed the other survivors. They fashioned makeshift weapons from whatever they could find, pikes from barrel hoops, clubs from wreckage. On this small patch of rock, the last vestige of law, order, and human decency prepared to make it stand. Cornelisz could not tolerate this pocket of resistance. The existence of Wiebbe Hayes and his soldiers was a direct challenge to his absolute authority. Gathering his best-armed mutineers, he launched a series of brutal assaults on Hayes's makeshift fort. The battle for the Abrolhos Islands began. It was a primal, desperate conflict. Cornelisz's men, wearing padded armor made from salvaged cloth and wielding muskets and swords, charged across the shallow reefs. Hayes's men, outnumbered and with vastly inferior weapons, fought back with desperate courage. They hurled rocks from their low walls and met the attackers in close-quarters combat with their crude pikes and clubs. The first two attacks were repelled, with the mutineers suffering heavy casualties. Their surprise at the soldiers' organized resistance turned to rage. Cornelisz, frustrated and furious, tried to negotiate, attempting to lure Hayes into a trap. But Hayes, now fully aware of the apothecary's treacherous nature, refused. The siege wore on, a brutal war of attrition between a disciplined group of soldiers fighting for survival and a murderous cult fighting to exterminate the last remnants of the old world. The fate of everyone left alive hung in the balance of these small, bloody skirmishes. Just as Hayes and his men were reaching their breaking point, their supplies dwindling and their bodies battered from constant fighting, a miracle appeared. On the horizon, a sail was spotted. It was the Sardam, the rescue ship with Commander Pelsaert aboard. He had made it to Batavia, and now he had returned. A frantic race began. Cornelisz and his mutineers saw the ship not as a rescue, but as their only means of escape and a prize to be captured. They immediately launched their final, most desperate assault on Hayes's fort, hoping to eliminate the soldiers before they could warn Pelsaert. Simultaneously, Hayes knew he had to reach the ship first to alert the rescuers to the mutiny. As the mutineers threw everything they had at the fort, Hayes, in a daring move, took a small makeshift raft and raced across the water towards the Sardam. He was a lone figure, paddling furiously, with the mutineers in hot pursuit in their own boat. It was a race against time, a dramatic climax where the first to reach the ship would determine the narrative and the fate of everyone who remained. Wiebbe Hayes won the race. He reached the Sardam moments before the mutineers, shouting warnings of the massacre and treason. Commander Pelsaert, armed with this knowledge, acted swiftly. When the mutineers' boat arrived, they were met not with unsuspecting sailors, but with armed soldiers. The plot to seize the ship was foiled, and the main leaders were captured. Pelsaert landed on the islands and was met with a scene of utter horror. He discovered the shallow graves and heard the first-hand accounts of the survivors. Justice was to be swift and brutal. A makeshift court was convened on the island itself. Jeronimus Cornelisz and his chief lieutenants were subjected to torture to extract full confessions. Pelsaert's journal details the gruesome proceedings. Cornelisz, even under extreme pain, never showed remorse, holding to his nihilistic beliefs to the very end. The sentences were carried out on the spot. Cornelisz and several others had their hands chopped off before being hanged. The spell was broken, the kingdom of terror was dismantled, and order, in its most brutal form, was restored to the islands of despair. The ordeal was over, but the scars remained. The surviving 68 passengers were taken to Batavia, where Wiebbe Hayes and his loyal soldiers were promoted and hailed as heroes. Other mutineers were tried and executed there. 2 of the youngest were marooned on the Australian mainland, becoming the first Europeans to live on the continent, their ultimate fate unknown. Francisco Pelsaert, despite successfully rescuing the survivors, was financially ruined, held partially responsible for the loss of the ship. The story of the Batavia became a legend, a cautionary tale whispered in Dutch taverns. It serves as a chilling reminder of the fragility of civilization. In the space of just a few months, a community of ordinary people, when stripped of society and law, descended into a state of primitive savagery orchestrated by one charismatic psychopath. The shipwreck didn't just break a vessel, it broke the social contract. But it also revealed the other side of human nature. The steadfast courage of Wiebbe Hayes and his men proves that even in the deepest darkness, duty, decency, and the will to resist tyranny can endure. The ghosts of the Batavia don't just haunt a remote Australian archipelago. They haunt our understanding of ourselves, asking a terrible question. How thin is the line between order and chaos, between the civilized human and the savage beast within?